I was 65 and lonely when I hired that 20-year-old boy to help around my farm. What I didn't know was that he had needs, dangerous needs, and for 8 months, he forced himself on me every single day, sometimes 8 times a day, until I couldn't tell where the pain ended and I began. My name is Hirath Jones. I'm 78 years old now, and everybody in Guthrie Springs knows me as the quiet widow who sells preserves at the church bazaar and keeps to herself on that old farm out on Millfield Road. They see me in my Sunday dress, hair pinned neat, counting out change with these shaky old hands, and they think they know my story. They think I'm just another lonely old woman whose biggest worry is whether the tomatoes will ripen before the first frost. But I got something inside me that's been eating at my soul for 13 years now, something I never told a living soul, not even Pastor Williams when he came calling after Frank passed. It's a story about trust broken so bad it nearly killed me, about how a person can disappear inside their own life, and about what happens when you finally find the strength to take it back. I've carried this weight long enough, and I reckon it's time to set it down. Maybe it'll help somebody else who's walking in the dark like I was. Maybe it'll just help me sleep better, knowing the truth ain't trapped inside me no more. So settle in with me, if you would. Pour yourself some sweet tea and sit a spell, because what I'm about to tell you is gonna take us down some dark roads before we find our way back to the light. And Lord knows, we all need somebody to walk with us through the shadows. You know, people always ask me why I didn't just call the police, why I didn't scream, why I didn't fight harder, but they don't understand what it's like when your whole world shrinks down to the size of fear, when every day becomes about surviving till the next one. They don't know what it's like to be 65 years old and suddenly realize that your body ain't yours anymore, that the home you built with your husband's hands has turned into a prison. After Frank died, this old farm felt like a tomb. The silence was so thick I could taste it, heavy as molasses on a July day. The work was piling up something fierce, fences falling down, gutters clogged, hay that needed cutting, but I couldn't manage the machinery no more. My arthritis was acting up bad that winter, and I was stubborn as an old mule about asking for help. Frank always said I was too proud for my own good, and Lord, was he right about that? So I put that little ad in the Guthrie Springs Gazette. Nothing fancy, just needed somebody strong and willing to work for fair wages and a place to stay in the old hired hands cabin out back. I figured maybe some college boy home for the summer, or a drifter looking to earn honest money. I never imagined I was inviting the devil himself onto my land. The morning Leo knocked on my screen door. I was making biscuits and the kitchen smelled like home, flour and butter, and that good smell of dough rising. He was clean-cut, polite as Sunday service, with these bright blue eyes that reminded me of Frank when he was courting me. Said he'd grown up on a farm in Kentucky, knew his way around livestock and machinery. Had references to, though I was too trusting to check them proper. I remember thinking God had sent me an angel. This sweet boy with his easy smile and strong hands, calling me ma'am, and asking if he could fix my porch step that had been wobbling for months. He worked harder than anybody I'd seen in years. And for the first time since Frank passed, I heard laughter coming from the barn again. But there were little things, small as pinpricks, that should have warned me. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. How he'd stand too close when I was showing him something, close enough that I could smell the sweat on his skin. The questions he asked about my routine, about who came visiting, about whether I had family that checked on me regular. I told myself it was just curiosity, maybe even kindness. Lord knows I was hungry for conversation after all those months of talking to nothing but the chickens and the old barn cat. I was so grateful for the company, so relieved to have help with the work, that I ignored what my gut was trying to tell me. The third week he was there, I caught him going through my desk drawers. When I asked what he was looking for, he smiled that same sweet smile and said he was just trying to find a pen to write his mama. But I knew I kept all the pens in the kitchen jar, had for 20 years. That night, I lay in bed listening to the floorboards creak in the cabin, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. And that's when I started to understand that some hungers can't ever be satisfied, no matter how much you feed them. Looking back now, I can see how he played me like a fiddle, slow and careful, tuning each string until the whole song belonged to him. But at the time, Lord help me, I was just so grateful to have somebody young and strong around the place that I couldn't see the web he was spinning. Leo had this way of making himself useful that went beyond the work I'd hired him for. He'd noticed things like how I struggled to reach the high shelves in the pantry, or how my hands shook trying to open pickle jars. Before I knew it, he was doing my grocery shopping, saying it wasn't no trouble since he was heading to town anyway. He'd come back with everything on my list, plus little extras he said reminded him of his grandmother back in Kentucky. The boy could tell stories that'd make you forget your own troubles. Evenings after supper, we'd sit on the porch and he'd talk about growing up on his family's tobacco farm, about his mama who made the best cornbread in 3 counties, about his daddy who died in a farming accident when Leo was just 16. The way he told it, with his voice getting soft and his eyes looking off toward the horizon, it near broke my heart. Made me want to mother him, you know? Made me feel like maybe God had brought us together so we could heal each other's loneliness. He had this habit of touching things when he talked, running his fingers along the porch railing, picking at a loose thread on his shirt, fidgeting with whatever was in reach. I thought it was just nervous energy from a young man not used to sitting still, but now I realize he was mapping everything, learning every inch of my space, figuring out how things worked, where things were kept. The questions started innocent enough. He'd ask about Frank while we were working in the garden, about how long we'd been married, whether we'd had children. When I told him we'd tried for years but never were blessed that way, his face got real tender and he said I would have made a wonderful mother. It was exactly what my bruised heart needed to hear, and I ate it up like honey. He got real interested in my routines too. What time I got up, when I fed the chickens, whether I listened to the radio in the evenings. Said he wanted to make sure he wasn't disturbing me, being respectful of my space and my habits. I thought it was thoughtful, the kind of consideration Frank used to show when we were first married and still learning each other's ways. But the thing that should have warned me was how he talked about the neighbors, always asking who came by, how often, whether they called first or just dropped in. When I mentioned that old Mrs. Patterson from down the road brought me soup when I was feeling poorly, he got real quiet and asked if she had a key to the house. Said he was worried about my safety, living out here alone with so many people having access. That's when he started suggesting little changes. Maybe I shouldn't leave the spare key under the flower pot anymore. Anybody could find it there. Maybe I should get an answering machine so I could screen my calls, not have to rush to the phone when my arthritis was acting up. Maybe I should let him handle talking to folks who came by while I was resting. No need for me to tire myself with visitors when I was feeling poorly. Each suggestion made sense on its own, like puzzle pieces that looked innocent until you stepped back and saw the picture they were making. He was building walls around me so slow and careful that I helped him lay every brick. I remember the exact moment I should have known. It was a Tuesday evening in late May, air thick with the smell of honeysuckle, and Leo was helping me carry in laundry from the line. His hand brushed mine when we both reached for the same sheet, and instead of pulling away polite-like, he let it linger. The look in his eyes wasn't respectful anymore. It was hungry, calculating, like he was measuring something. But I was so starved for human touch, for any kind of connection, that I convinced myself I was imagining things. I was just a lonely old woman, reading too much into a simple accident. After all, who would want anything from someone like me? I should have trusted that chill that ran down my spine, should have listened when every instinct I had started screaming. But by then, I was already caught in his trap, and he was just waiting for the right moment to spring it shut. The night everything changed was the kind of June evening that fools you into thinking the world is still a safe place. The air was soft and sweet with the smell of my climbing roses, crickets singing their nighttime songs, and a breeze moving through the wheat field like God's own whisper. I was sitting on the porch after supper, watching Leo fix the gate latch that had been giving me trouble for months, when he looked up at me with those blue eyes and said something that made my blood run cold. He told me he'd been going through Frank's things in the barn, things I hadn't touched since my husband passed because it hurt too much to see his work clothes still hanging on their hooks, his tools still arranged just the way he liked them. Leo said he was just trying to organize everything, make it easier for me to find what I needed. But then, he mentioned Frank's old hunting rifle, asked if I knew it was missing from the gun cabinet. That rifle had been Frank's daddy's before it was his, and Frank's granddaddy's before that. Frank used to clean it every fall even though he hadn't hunted in years. Said it was about respecting the past, honoring the men who came before. I knew exactly where that gun was supposed to be, and I knew Frank would never have left it anywhere but locked up proper in that cabinet. When I told Leo the rifle wasn't missing, Just moved to the closet in our bedroom for safekeeping. His whole face changed. Not angry, exactly, but something harder, more focused, like he'd been wearing a mask and it had just slipped enough for me to see what was underneath. He asked why I'd move it, said it wasn't safe for an old woman to keep a loaded gun in her bedroom where she might get confused in the dark. I never said it was loaded, but somehow he knew. That's when the pieces started falling together in my mind like dominoes, each one hitting the next until the whole picture came clear. He'd been in my bedroom, going through my private things while I was in town, or working in the garden. He knew about the money I kept in the old coffee tin on the top shelf of my closet, Frank's life insurance money that I was saving for when I got too old to manage on my own. He knew I took sleeping pills on nights when the arthritis was bad, knew I was a heavy sleeper once they kicked in, and he knew I was alone out here, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nobody checking on me regular except for church on Sundays. The way he was looking at me in that moment, sitting there on my porch steps with my husband's screwdriver in his hands, I realized I wasn't seeing Leo, the helpful farm boy, anymore. I was seeing something else entirely, something that had been waiting patient as a spider, for the right moment to show itself. The polite young man who called me ma'am and fixed my porch steps was just clothing he wore over something much darker. That night, I lay in bed listening to every sound the old house made, every creak and sigh of settling wood, wondering if what I was hearing was just the house talking to itself the way it always did, or if it was footsteps in the hallway outside my door. I'd locked my bedroom door for the first time since Frank died, and I kept that old rifle across my lap until dawn. Even though my hands shook so bad I couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn, I kept telling myself I was being foolish, that Leo was just a young man trying to help and I was letting my imagination run wild. But deep down, in that place where a woman keeps her truest knowing, I understood that I'd invited something into my home that wasn't planning to leave, something that had been studying me like a book, learning all my weaknesses, all my fears, all the ways I could be broken. The next morning at breakfast, Leo was back to his sweet, helpful self, asking if I'd slept well, noticing that I looked tired and offering to handle the morning chores so I could rest. But I caught him watching me different now, like he was waiting for something, measuring my reactions to see how much I suspected. And that's when I knew for certain that whatever was coming, it was coming soon. The only question was whether I'd be strong enough to survive it. It happened on a Thursday night when the summer heat had broken, and a storm was rolling in from the west, making the air thick and electric like the world was holding its breath. I'd taken one of my sleeping pills because my hip was aching, something fierce, and I was drifting off when I heard my bedroom door open slow and careful, like someone was trying not to wake the dead. At first, my mind tried to make it innocent. Maybe Leo heard the thunder and was checking to make sure I was all right, or maybe he thought he heard me call out. But when I opened my eyes just a crack, pretending to still be asleep, I could see his shape in the doorway, darker than the darkness around him, and I knew this wasn't about kindness or concern. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, just watching me breathe, learning the rhythm of my sleep. The sleeping pill made everything feel like I was moving through molasses, but my mind was sharp with terror, every nerve in my body screaming even though I couldn't make my muscles obey. When he finally stepped into the room, I could smell him. Not just his usual scent of work, sweat, and soap, but something else. Something hungry and wrong. What happened next? I can't tell you in detail because some things are too dark for words, too shameful for an old woman to speak aloud even after all these years. But I can tell you that when a person takes what isn't theirs to take, they steal more than just your body. They steal your sense of safety, your trust in your own judgment, your belief that the world makes sense. The worst part wasn't the pain, though there was plenty of that. The worst part was how careful he was not to leave marks where anyone might see them, how he whispered that this was what I wanted, what I'd been asking for with my loneliness and my need for company. He made it sound like I'd brought this on myself, like I was lucky anyone would want an old woman like me. When it was over, he smoothed my hair back from my face, gentle as a lover, and told me how this was going to be from now on, how I was going to be good to him, grateful for his attention, and how nobody would ever believe me if I tried to tell anyone what kind of man he really was. After all, who would believe that sweet Leo, the polite young man who helped the poor old widow with her farm work, would do such a thing? He reminded me how isolated I was out here, how I'd already told everyone in town that he was such a blessing, such a godsend. If I tried to make trouble now, People would think the grief and loneliness had finally cracked my mind. They'd say I was having fantasies, making up stories for attention, or maybe getting confused the way old people sometimes do. And the terrible truth was, he was right. I could already hear how it would sound. Poor old Hareth, lost without her Frank. Probably dreaming about the handsome young man helping her, and getting confused about what was real and what was wishful thinking. The shame of it burned hotter than any physical pain he'd caused me. The next morning, Leo was back to his helpful, respectful self, asking if I needed anything from town, offering to pick up my prescription from the pharmacy. But now, I could see the knowledge in his eyes, the satisfaction of a predator who'd successfully claimed his territory. He'd tested me and found out exactly how powerless I was, how completely he could control my world. That's when I understood that this wasn't going to be something that happened once and was over. This was my new reality, and Leo was planning to stay as long as it pleased him. I was trapped in my own home, with a monster wearing the face of an angel, and nobody in the world would ever believe me if I tried to tell them the truth. But what Leo didn't know yet was that this old woman had survived 65 years of life by learning when to bend and when to break. And I was already starting to plan how to get my life back from him, even if it killed me trying. The days that followed blurred together like a fever dream, each one bleeding into the next until I lost track of time altogether. Leo had settled into a routine that made my skin crawl during the day. He was still the helpful farmhand, fixing things around the property and being polite as pie to anyone who might drop by. But once the sun went down and we were alone, he became something else entirely. He'd moved himself into the main house without asking, claiming the guest room that used to be Frank's study. Said it made more sense than walking back and forth to the cabin, especially with storm season coming. But I knew the real reason he wanted to be close enough to control every breath I took, every move I made. The worst part was how he'd made me complicit in my own prison. When Mrs. Patterson came by with a casserole, worried because she hadn't seen me at church the past 2 Sundays, Leo answered the door with that charming smile and explained how I'd been feeling poorly, how he was taking good care of me but I needed rest. Through the kitchen window, I could see her nodding sympathetically, probably thinking what a blessing it was that I had such a thoughtful young man looking after me. I wanted to scream, to run to her and beg for help, but Leo's hand was resting on my shoulder like a weight, his fingers pressing just hard enough to remind me what would happen if I stepped out of line. So I smiled and waved and told her I was feeling much better, thank you for asking, and watched her drive away, taking my last chance at rescue with her. That night, Leo sat across from me at the kitchen table, where Frank and I used to share our evening coffee, and he laid out the new rules like he was discussing the weather. I wasn't to answer the phone unless he said it was okay. I wasn't to go into town without him. I wasn't to have visitors without his permission. And if anyone asked why I seemed different, I was to blame it on grief, on getting older, on anything except the truth. He'd thought of everything, the clever devil. He'd been watching and learning for weeks before he made his move, figuring out exactly how to isolate me without anyone noticing. He knew that people expect old folks to slow down, to become more reclusive, to need help with things they used to manage on their own. He was using my age against me, making my natural vulnerabilities into weapons. But the thing that scared me most was how he talked about the future, like this arrangement was permanent, like he planned to stay until I died and probably inherit everything I owned. He'd been through my papers, my will, my bank statements. He knew exactly what I was worth and how long he figured I'd last under his care. The physical demands got worse too, more frequent and more degrading. He seemed to take pleasure, not just in the act itself, but in watching me try to hold on to some shred of dignity while he systematically destroyed everything that made me feel human. He'd force me to thank him afterward, to tell him how grateful I was for his attention, how lucky I was to have him. During the day, when exhaustion and shame made me feel like I was disappearing into myself, I'd catch glimpses of the woman I used to be in the mirror and wonder if she was gone forever. My reflection looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, trembling, aged 10 years in just a few weeks. I was becoming a ghost in my own life. It was around this time that I started noticing Leo going through Frank's belongings with a different kind of interest. Not just organizing like he'd claimed, but studying them. Asking questions about Frank's habits, his friends, his business dealings. He seemed particularly interested in Frank's old address book and the box of letters from Frank's army buddy who lived down in Arkansas. One evening, I caught him on the phone in Frank's study, speaking in low tones to someone I couldn't identify. When he saw me in the doorway, he hung up quick and smiled that cold smile, asking if I needed anything, but I'd heard enough to know he was making plans, talking about timelines and opportunities, using words like inheritance and natural causes. That's when I realized this wasn't just about power and control anymore. Leo wasn't planning to keep me as his prisoner indefinitely. He was planning to kill me. And he was smart enough to make it look like the natural death of a lonely old woman who'd simply given up after losing her husband. But he'd made one crucial mistake in all his careful planning. He'd underestimated what a woman will do when she realizes she's got nothing left to lose except the last few breaths in her body. And I was about to show him that this old farmhouse held more secrets than he'd ever imagined. The morning I found Leo reading Frank's private journals, something inside me finally snapped like a dry branch in a winter storm. Those journals were sacred to me. Frank's thoughts about the farm, about our marriage, about his fears and dreams, written in his careful handwriting during the quiet hours before dawn. Leo was sitting at Frank's old oak desk, boots propped up like he owned the place, turning pages like he was reading the newspaper instead of my husband's most private thoughts. When I asked what he thought he was doing, he didn't even look up, just kept reading, and told me he was trying to understand Frank better, said it would help him take better care of the farm. But I could see which entries he'd marked with little pieces of paper, the ones where Frank wrote about his life insurance policy, about his will, about how worried he was that I'd be alone if something happened to him. That's when Leo looked up at me with those cold blue eyes and said something that made my blood turn to ice. He told me Frank had been a good man, a careful man, the kind of man who would want his wife to be taken care of properly after he was gone, the kind of man who would understand that sometimes a woman needs a strong hand to guide her, especially when grief makes her confused and forgetful. The way he said forgetful made it clear he was already building his story for when I was gone. Poor old Hireth, losing her memory, getting confused about things, not able to take care of herself properly. It would be so natural for her to have an accident, or maybe just fade away from sadness and old age, especially with all the stress she'd been under since Frank died. He'd been poisoning me slow and steady, I realized, not with anything dramatic that would show up in an autopsy, but with little things, adding extra sleeping pills to my evening tea, making sure I ate less and less each day by claiming he was worried about my digestion, encouraging me to stay in bed longer each morning because I seemed so tired. He was making me weak and confused on purpose, creating the perfect conditions for what he'd make look like natural decline. But the thing that terrified me most was when he started talking about Frank's old army buddy, Billy Crowder, down in Arkansas. Leo had been corresponding with Billy, telling him how worried he was about my mental state, how I'd been having episodes of confusion and paranoia. Billy had been Frank's closest friend, and if Leo had convinced him that I was losing my mind, then Billy would corroborate whatever story Leo told when I was found dead. I realized Leo had been setting this up from the very beginning. All those questions about my family, my friends, my routines, he'd been mapping out every person who might ask questions when I died, and systematically neutralizing each one. Mrs. Patterson already thought I was getting frail and forgetful. Pastor Williams hadn't seen me at church in weeks, and probably figured I was having a crisis of faith. Even Dr. Morrison would remember that I'd been complaining about feeling tired and confused at my last appointment. The isolation wasn't just about controlling me in the present. It was about making sure no one would investigate when I was gone. Leo would inherit everything as my poor, devoted caretaker who'd done his best but couldn't save me from my own decline. He'd probably even get sympathy from the whole town for sticking by a difficult old woman until the end. That night, lying in my own bed, listening to him move around the house like he already owned it, I made a decision that scared me more than anything he'd done to me so far. I was going to fight back. Not with screaming or running. I was too old and weak for that, and he'd just overpower me like he had every other time. But with the one thing I had left that he didn't know about, the secrets this old farmhouse held, secrets that Frank had shown me years ago and made me promise never to tell a living soul. See, this house had been in Frank's family for 4 generations, and it had seen its share of troubles over the years. During Prohibition, Frank's granddaddy had hidden things here that needed hiding. During the Depression, Frank's daddy had stored things here that needed storing. And, during our early years together, When money was tight and the law wasn't always on the side of small farmers, Frank and I had learned to be creative about solving our problems. Leo thought he knew every inch of my property, but there were places he'd never found, things he'd never seen, knowledge he'd never gained, no matter how many of Frank's papers he read or how many questions he asked. This land held secrets that went deeper than any journal, older than any document, and I was about to use them against him. The next morning, when Leo asked me what I wanted for breakfast like the caring caretaker he pretended to be during daylight hours, I looked him straight in the eye and smiled for the first time in weeks, because I finally had a plan, and for once, I was the one with the secret. The plan started forming in my mind like morning mist rising from the creek, slow and careful, taking shape one piece at a time. For 3 days, I played the part of the broken old woman. Leo expected me to be docile, confused, grateful for his twisted version of care. But inside, I was remembering things Frank had taught me about survival, about the kind of knowledge that gets passed down through generations of farmers who learn to handle their own problems. Leo had gotten cocky, comfortable in his control over me. He'd started leaving me alone for longer periods, driving into town in my old Ford truck like he owned it, running errands, and probably laying more groundwork for his story about my declining health. He'd even started drinking Frank's good whiskey in the evenings, the bottle Frank had been saving for our 50th wedding anniversary that we never got to celebrate. It was during one of these absences that I made my way down to the root cellar for the first time since he'd arrived. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and the air was cool and earthy, thick with the smell of stored potatoes and canned peaches. But I wasn't there for the preserves. I was there for what Frank had hidden behind the false wall at the back. The space his granddaddy had built during the lean years when a man needed to protect what was his. My hands were shaking as I felt along the stones until I found the loose one, the way Frank had shown me all those years ago. Behind it was the metal box that held things we'd hoped we'd never need, things from a time when the bank was threatening to foreclose and desperate times called for desperate measures. Inside that box was something Leo had never thought to look for, something that could change the balance of power between us in ways he couldn't imagine. But as I was climbing back up those cellar steps, clutching that box to my chest like salvation itself, I heard the rumble of the Ford's engine coming up the drive. Leo was back earlier than expected, and I barely had time to hide the box in my bedroom closet before his footsteps crossed the porch. He seemed different that evening, more agitated than usual, pacing around the kitchen like a caged animal. When I asked if something was wrong, playing the concerned caretaker myself now, he told me he'd been talking to people in town, spreading more stories about my condition. Apparently, he'd convinced Doc Morrison that I might be having small strokes, explaining why I seemed so confused and forgetful. He'd even suggested that I might benefit from being in a facility where I could get proper care. The cold calculation in his voice when he talked about moving me to a nursing home made my skin crawl. I could see his whole plan now. First make me appear incompetent, then have me committed somewhere he could control my medical care completely. In a place like that, it would be easy for someone to slip away quietly, especially an old woman with no family to ask questions. But then, he said something that made my blood run colder than Winter Creek water. He told me he'd been in contact with a lawyer about updating my will, making sure my affairs were in order, given my declining mental state. Of course, he'd volunteered to help with the paperwork. Being such a devoted caretaker, the lawyer was coming out to the house tomorrow to discuss arrangements. That's when I realized I was out of time. Whatever I was going to do, it had to happen tonight, before Leo could get legal control over my life and my property. Once those papers were signed, I'd be completely at his mercy, and mercy wasn't something that Munster possessed. As we sat at the dinner table that night, him eating the pot roast I'd made with hands that trembled from more than just age, me picking at my food because my stomach was tied in knots, I watched him like I was seeing him for the first time. This man who'd fooled me so completely, who'd turned my own kindness against me, who'd made my home into a prison and my body into his property. But he was looking at me different too, studying my face like he was trying to read my thoughts. For a moment, I worried that I'd given something away, that he could sense the change in me. When he asked if I was feeling all right, said I seemed more alert than usual, I quickly put on the confused, fragile act that had become my disguise. After dinner, he told me to go to bed early, said he had some phone calls to make about tomorrow's arrangements. But as I was walking toward my bedroom, I heard him talking low on the phone, and what I caught made my heart nearly stop. He was discussing timing, talking about how sometimes old people just don't wake up in their sleep, how peaceful it would be after all the confusion and struggle. Lying in my bed that night, listening to him move around the house making his final preparations, I knew this was my last chance. Tomorrow that lawyer would come, and by tomorrow night, Leo would make sure I never saw another sunrise. But what he didn't know was that this old woman still had one trick left, one secret weapon that 4 generations of my husband's family had passed down for exactly this kind of moment. And I was finally ready to use it. I waited until I heard Leo's breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep. The kind of heavy slumber that comes from drinking too much of Frank's good whiskey and feeling secure in your victory. The old mantel clock in the hallway chimed midnight as I slipped out of my bed, my bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors I'd walked for 43 years. Every creak of the house seemed loud as thunder as I made my way to the closet where I'd hidden that metal box. My hands shook so bad I could barely work the old combination lock, Frank's birthday. The same numbers we'd used for everything important. Inside was what I'd hoped I'd never need, a small glass vial filled with clear liquid that Frank's granddaddy had kept for emergencies, the kind of emergencies that called for permanent solutions. Frank had explained it to me once, years ago when we'd found the box while cleaning out the root cellar. His granddaddy had been a practical man living in hard times, and sometimes practical men had to make hard choices about threats to their family. The liquid was tasteless, odorless, and would look like a heart attack to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But it would take hours to work, and it would be peaceful, not the violent end Leo had planned for me. As I stood there in my nightgown, holding that vial in my trembling hands, I thought about the woman I used to be, Herath Jones, who baked cookies for church socials and cried over movies with sad endings, who couldn't even kill the chickens for Sunday dinner without Frank's help. That woman would never have contemplated what I was about to do. But that woman had died the first night Leo came into my bedroom uninvited. And what was left was something harder, something that understood survival comes at a price. I thought about Frank, about what he would say if he could see me now. Would he understand that sometimes love means protecting what's sacred, even if it requires unspeakable choices? Would he forgive me for using his family's darkest secret to save myself? Or would he be ashamed that his gentle wife had become someone capable of such calculated action? But then I remembered Leo's hands on me, his whispered threats, his plans to steal not just my life, but my death. To make even my final moments serve his purposes. I thought about all the other lonely women out there who might fall into his trap after me, who might suffer what I'd suffered because I was too weak to stop him when I had the chance. The kitchen was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window over the sink, the same window where I used to watch Frank working in the garden, back when the world made sense and monsters were just stories told to frighten children. I moved carefully, guided by 40 years of knowing where everything belonged in this room. Leo had left his coffee cup on the counter, the one he always used in the mornings, along with the half-empty whiskey bottle. He was a creature of habit, my tormentor, always the same routine. Always the same arrogant confidence that he was smarter than everyone around him. But habits could be used against a person, especially by someone who'd been watching and learning, just like he had. I prepared his morning coffee exactly the way he liked it, strong and black, with just a touch of sugar. The vial was so small it disappeared completely into the dark liquid, leaving no trace, no smell, no hint of what was coming. By the time he took his first sip tomorrow morning, it would already be too late to change course. As I stood there looking at that cup, innocent as any other morning's coffee, I felt something break inside me that would never heal properly again. I was about to become a killer, even if it was in self-defense, even if it was the only way to save myself and possibly others. The weight of that knowledge settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket, heavy and permanent. But alongside the horror was something else, a fierce, bright flame of satisfaction that I'd been underestimated one too many times. Leo thought I was just another helpless old woman, broken down by grief and fear, too weak and stupid to fight back. He'd never imagined that beneath my fragile exterior was for generations of survivors' wisdom, the kind of knowledge that comes from people who'd learned to do whatever was necessary to protect their own. I went back to my bedroom and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around me. Tomorrow would bring the end of this nightmare, one way or another. Either my plan would work and I'd be free, or Leo would discover what I'd done and kill me before the poison could take effect. But at least I'd go down fighting, not as the victim he'd tried to make me. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through my bedroom window, I heard Leo stirring in the next room, the sounds of him waking up for what would be his last morning on this earth. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what the day would bring. The morning light was just starting to paint the kitchen walls pale gold when I heard Leo's footsteps on the stairs, heavier than usual from the whiskey he'd consumed the night before. I was already sitting at the kitchen table, dressed in my best Sunday dress, the navy blue one with the little white flowers that Frank always said brought out my eyes. If this was going to be my last day on earth, I wanted to meet it with whatever dignity I had left. Leo shuffled into the kitchen wearing nothing but his jeans, his hair mussed from sleep, looking every bit the arrogant predator who'd made my life a living hell for the past months. He barely glanced at me as he reached for his coffee cup, the same routine he'd followed every morning since he'd moved into my house like he owned it. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could hear it, but my hands were steady as I watched him lift the cup to his lips. The first sip went down easy, just like always. He made that little satisfied sound he always made when the coffee hit his system. Never suspecting that this morning's brew carried more than caffeine, I forced myself to take a bite of toast, to act normal, to play the part of the defeated old woman one last time, while inside I was counting the minutes until justice finally came calling. But Leo was different this morning, more talkative than usual, almost giddy with anticipation about what he clearly saw as his final victory. He told me the lawyer would be here at 10 sharp, that everything was arranged to make the transition smooth and legal. He'd already prepared the story, how grief and isolation had affected my mind, how I'd become confused and paranoid, how I needed professional care that he couldn't provide alone. As he drank his coffee and outlined his plans, describing how peaceful my end would be once the paperwork was signed, I found myself studying his face with a strange kind of fascination. Here was evil in its most ordinary form, not the dramatic villain of movies and books, but just a man who'd learned that he could take whatever he wanted from people weaker than himself, and who'd gotten comfortable with the taking. He was on his second cup when the first signs appeared, a slight tremor in his hand as he set the cup down, a furrowing of his brow like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite grasp. He blamed it on the whiskey at first, said he probably shouldn't have finished Frank's bottle, but I could see the confusion starting to creep into his eyes. By the time he'd finished that second cup, his speech was starting to slur, just slightly, and he was having trouble focusing on what he was saying. The poison Frank's granddaddy had prepared all those years ago was doing exactly what it was designed to do, mimicking the symptoms of a stroke or heart attack, something that would look perfectly natural in a young man who'd been under stress, drinking too much, and pushing his body too hard. But then Leo did something I hadn't expected. Instead of continuing with his normal routine, he suddenly grabbed me by the arm, his grip still strong despite the poison working through his system. His eyes had gone from confused to suspicious, and I realized with a cold shock of terror that he was smarter than I'd given him credit for. Somehow, through the fog of whatever was happening to him, he'd figured out that this wasn't natural. He dragged me to the kitchen sink and tried to make himself vomit, but it was too late. The poison had been in his system for over an hour now, long enough to be absorbed completely. All he accomplished was making himself weaker, more disoriented, but also more desperate and dangerous. When he couldn't purge the poison from his body, he turned on me with a fury I'd never seen before, not even during his worst nighttime visits. Through gritted teeth, fighting against the toxin that was shutting down his nervous system, he told me exactly what he was going to do to me before he died. If he was going down, he was taking me with him, and he was going to make sure I suffered every second of it. His hands found my throat, and even weakened as he was still strong enough to squeeze the life out of me if I couldn't get away. But 43 years of living on this farm had made me tougher than I looked, and months of his abuse had taught me that sometimes you have to fight dirty to survive. I grabbed Frank's cast iron skillet from the stove, the same one I'd cooked thousands of meals in, the one that had fed my husband and warmed our home, and I brought it down on Leo's head with every ounce of strength these old arms still possessed. The sound it made was wet and final, like a melon dropping on concrete. Leo's hands released my throat and he crumpled to the kitchen floor, his blue eyes staring up at nothing, blood pooling beneath his head like a dark halo. The poison might have killed him eventually, but the skillet had finished the job quick and certain. I stood there for a long time, looking down at the body of the man who'd tormented me, who'd planned to steal my life and my death, both. I should have felt relief, or satisfaction, or at least the peace that comes with survival. But all I felt was empty, hollowed out like an old gourd, wondering what I'd become in order to save myself. The lawyer would be here in 2 hours. I had that long to clean up this mess, to stage a scene that would protect me from questions I couldn't answer, to transform a kitchen that had become a crime scene back into the innocent heart of a farmhouse where nothing more violent than Sunday dinner preparation had ever taken place. But as I looked at Leo's body, at the evidence of what I'd been forced to become, I realized that survival had come at a price I was only beginning to understand. I'd won my freedom, but I'd lost something else in the process, some essential part of myself that I'd never be able to get back. And the hardest part was knowing that I'd do it all again if I had to. You'd think the hardest part would be moving Leo's body, but you'd be wrong. At 78, I'm stronger than I look. Farm life does that to a woman, builds muscles in places city folk never knew existed. The hardest part was accepting what I'd become, standing there in my blood-spattered Sunday dress, looking down at a dead man in my kitchen, and feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. I had exactly 90 minutes before that lawyer arrived. 90 minutes to turn a crime scene back into the innocent kitchen of a grieving widow. But as I stood there planning how to dispose of the evidence, something caught my eye that made my blood run colder than it already was. Leo's wallet had fallen out of his pocket when he hit the floor, and scattered among his fake identification papers was a photograph that stopped my heart dead. It was a picture of me. Not recent, this was from maybe 15 years ago, taken at the church harvest festival. I was standing next to Frank by the apple cider booth, laughing at something Pastor Williams had said. But the photo was creased and worn, like someone had been carrying it for a long time, studying it, planning. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was my full name, my address, and details about Frank's death date. That's when the pieces started falling together in a way that made my head spin. Leo hadn't found me by accident through my newspaper ad. He'd been hunting me specifically, targeting me long before Frank died. Someone had given him that photograph, someone who knew my routine, my vulnerabilities, my exact situation, someone who wanted me dead and had hired Leo to make it happen. With shaking hands, I went through the rest of his things, and what I found made me understand that I'd been living in an even bigger nightmare than I'd imagined. There were other photographs, other widowed women from towns across 3 states, some I recognized from obituaries I'd seen in the regional papers, deaths that had seemed natural at the time but now took on a sinister meaning. Leo wasn't just a drifter who preyed on vulnerable women, he was a professional killer who specialized in making murders look like natural deaths. But the photograph that nearly made my knees give out was at the bottom of his wallet. It was Frank, taken without his knowledge outside Morrison's Hardware just a few weeks before he died. On the back was a date and a single word that made everything clear. Completed. Frank hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been murdered. The room started spinning as I realized the scope of what I was dealing with. Someone had paid Leo to kill my husband and then, after a decent interval, to kill me too. Probably for the farm, for the life insurance money, for reasons I couldn't even begin to guess. But whoever it was had underestimated what this old woman was capable of when pushed too far. I was still reeling from this revelation when I heard a car coming up the gravel drive. The lawyer was early, and I still had a dead body on my kitchen floor and blood spattered across my walls. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of panic, I felt a calm settle over me like I hadn't experienced since before Frank died. I finally understood what I was really fighting for, moving faster than I had in years. I dragged Leo's body to the root cellar, the same place where I'd found the poison that killed him. The old stone walls down there had seen secrets before, and they'd keep one more. I cleaned the kitchen with bleach and elbow grease, changed into a fresh dress, and was sitting calmly at the table with a cup of tea when the lawyer knocked on my door. Mr. Henderson was a thin, nervous man who kept checking his pocket watch and asking where my caretaker had gone. I told him Leo had been called away suddenly, family emergency down in Kentucky, and I was managing just fine on my own. Thank you very much. When he tried to insist that I needed someone to look after me, that I seemed confused about my own affairs, I fixed him with a stare that Frank used to say could freeze hellfire. I told Mr. Henderson that rumors of my mental decline had been greatly exaggerated, and that I'd decided not to make any changes to my will after all. In fact, I was feeling better than I had in months, clearer in my thinking, more capable of managing my own life, when he persisted, mentioning that he'd been told I was having episodes of confusion and paranoia. I asked him exactly who had told him such things. The name he gave me was one I knew well, Billy Crowder, Frank's old army buddy down in Arkansas, the man Frank had trusted with his life during the war, the man I'd considered calling when I first got lonely after Frank passed, the man who knew every detail about our finances, our property, our habits, because Frank had shared everything with his dearest friend. After the lawyer left, looking confused and a little frightened by the change in me, I sat in Frank's old chair and thought about betrayal, about how the people closest to us are often the ones with the best opportunities to hurt us, about how trust, once broken, reveals truths we never wanted to see. I never called the police about Leo, never reported him missing. As far as anyone in town knew, the young man who'd been helping me had simply moved on, the way drifters do. If anyone asked, I'd say he'd gotten homesick for Kentucky and decided to go back to his family. People understood things like that, but I did make some calls of my own, to widows in other towns whose husbands had died suddenly, whose helpful young caretakers had disappeared around the same time, to insurance companies and coroners and anyone else who might be interested in patterns they hadn't noticed before. Amazing how many people are willing to listen when an old woman starts asking the right questions. Billy Crowder had a stroke 3 months later. Natural causes. The doctors said stress and high blood pressure and too many cigarettes finally caught up with him. I sent flowers to his funeral. Signed the card with deepest sympathy, from Frank's widow. His wife probably thought it was a nice gesture from an old friend. I'm 78 years old now, and I've learned that survival sometimes requires becoming someone you never thought you could be. I've learned that evil often wears a familiar face, that the people we trust the most can be the ones planning our destruction. But I've also learned that there's strength in places we never knew to look for it, and that it's never too late to fight back against the darkness. Some nights, I still hear Leo's footsteps in the house, still feel the weight of what I did to save myself, but I sleep better now than I have in years, because I know that monster can't hurt me or anyone else ever again. And sometimes, when the moon is full and the night is quiet, I swear I can feel Frank's hand on my shoulder, telling me he's proud of what his gentle wife found the courage to do. If my story moves you, if it makes you think about the quiet battles being fought behind closed doors in small towns everywhere, then maybe Leo's death served a purpose after all. Maybe some good can come from the worst things we do when we're fighting for our lives. I want you to remember that age doesn't make us helpless, that being alone doesn't make us defenseless, that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply surviving when someone expects you to die. And if you know an elderly person who seems to be declining suddenly, who's isolated from friends and family, who's being cared for by someone they barely know, ask questions, trust your instincts. Don't let another person disappear into the shadows without someone noticing. My name is Hirath Jones. I'm 78 years old, and I'm still here. Still telling my truth, still refusing to be forgotten, still proving that this old farmhouse holds more secrets than anyone could ever imagine. If you're watching this from wherever you are in this wide world, I'd love to know where my words have reached. Drop me a comment. Tell me your city. Let me know I'm not alone in this darkness. And if you think someone else needs to hear this story, if you believe there are others out there fighting battles they can't talk about, then help my voice travel farther than these old walls. Subscribe to my channel, share my story, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. We all deserve to live without fear in our own homes. We all deserve to die with dignity on our own terms. And sometimes, we have to fight like hell to make sure that happens.